As you guys know, I've been ramping up a lot of activity on the channel recently. We've had amazing episodes. We just interviewed James Fox, the best documentarian in UFO history, Lou Elizondo, OG whistleblower from 2017 that is basically responsible for a lot of the modern disclosure we've seen. It's been a really fun couple of months. But a lot of people ask me, they say, Jesse, why can't we get full UFO disclosure? So I wanted to make a video addressing that. It seems like most of what we have are sort of bits and pieces of material. It should be noted that if you actually speak to a lot of people in and around the program, which it feels like Ross Coulthart and a few other select reporters are doing, we don't seem to have that many wholly intact craft in our possession.
It is my belief that the United States is in possession of exotic material.
So again, whether it's Stanford professor Gary Nolan, who actually showed me his UFO crash pieces, or other civilians who seem to have collected pieces here and there, it's really important to do things like mass spectrometry and deeper analysis to rule out other options. You know, maybe these things are meteors, they could be man-made. It's really important we go deeper on the material analysis to ensure that that's not the case. I also think these crafts are probably extremely sensitive artifacts of American national security. But until we're shown any sort of intact craft, we have to think probabilistically, and we need some epistemic humility. We can't be making super bold claims around these crafts definitely existing. Having said that, I think all of this brings a really important philosophical question up around what is UFO disclosure. I do think material analysis is a good inroad to disclosure. For example, if we figured out whether any of these materials were arranged deliberately on an atomic level, that would be basically a smoking gun that they're non-human, because humans don't have that level of granularity when it comes to fabricating materials. So I think materials analysis is actually a decent inroad when it comes to disclosure. There are other tracks of disclosure, I just don't think they're the smoking gun that people actually want. So Avi Loeb is putting up a bunch of sensors to get signatures that might represent UFO activity above the Harvard Observatory.
So the Galileo Project is basically an attempt to collect new data, new evidence, using the scientific method without prejudice, being agnostic about what we might find in our fishing net. We cast the fishing net, it's a fishing expedition. We don't know what we will find. It's probably a mixed bag. It will be a collection of natural objects, a collection of human-made objects. But even if one object happens to come from an extraterrestrial technological origin, that will be the most significant discovery of humanity.
I applaud this. I think it's a great idea. However, I think if you're an average person, just seeing, you know, a bunch of signatures in the abstract on some sort of Excel sheet database is not going to convince you that we're not alone, and that aliens might exist or non-human intelligence exists, and that UFOs are actually flying around near the Harvard Observatory. While I think this work is incredibly important, I don't think abstract physics is tangible enough. The next approach would be finding video. Now, I'm not a VFX guy. I think we live in this world of deep fakes where it's really hard to tell real videos from fake videos, and so I think it's incredibly important that we surface as many videos as we can that we think are high fidelity and credible. And so people like Jeremy Corbell are doing a great job when it comes to this.
What's so interesting about this footage is it has now been confirmed by the Pentagon that it is actual Navy filmed footage. So you're seeing a thermal imagery.
But unless you have the expertise to actually verify the credibility of these videos, understand their entire chain of custody, how they were filmed, the machinery and equipment that caught these videos, I'm just not sure that you won't have permanent doubters on any of these videos.
Regarding the jellyfish UAP, in your opinion, it was birds migrating, or you were just making an analogy?
It ended up being debunked. It wasn't anything. It was not a UAP.
If we were being visited, I'm thinking we'd have something better than fuzzy monochromatic video of objects that apparently reveal themselves only to Navy pilots.
Finally, there's legislature and government action. Betting on government inertia is always a good bet, and betting on government action is almost always a bad bet. And so while this work is incredibly important when it comes to our civilian Congress having some transparency and oversight into the UFO issue, which they are now starting to gain, I just don't think this axis of progress is gonna move fast enough. Just look at last year, we had this Schumer amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which got entirely gutted. One of the biggest parts of this amendment involved congressional oversight over the UFOs themselves. Basically, the ability for Congress to declare eminent domain or ownership over any UFOs that private aerospace companies might be in possession of. I think if that were passed, it would be a major, major deal. And I encourage all of you to discuss this with your local congressmen and women. But as you saw then, and as you're seeing this year, it seems like these initiatives keep getting gutted.
The measure I championed with Senator Rounds would create a board, just like we did with the JFK assassination records, to work through the declassification of many government records on UAPs. This model's been a terrific success for decades. It should be used again with UAPs, but once again, House Republicans are ready to kill this bipartisan provision.
Our government is unfortunately controlled by special interests and big corporations. And a lot of these big corporations are the same defense contractors that donate to the campaigns of the congresspeople who are gutting this bill. Just take Mike Turner. He had a huge part in diluting the wording around the Schumer Amendment last year. He represents Dayton, Ohio, which is where Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is and where a lot of the UFO rumors are centered. Another cul-de-sac when it comes to UFO disclosure that I am sometimes guilty of myself is theorizing. So I think there are, amazing theorists like Mike Masters and Jacques Vallée who talk about, okay, we're seeing all these UFOs in the sky, we have these abduction cases.
What do you make of the whole abduction hypothesis?
There we're going to the second level, which is the physiological and psychological level. There is no question in my mind that something has happened to those people. In other words, those are real occurrences. Those are not imaginary or purely psychological.
What are the non-human intelligence? How can we kind of create a hierarchy out of them? How can we figure out their intent? All of that is incredibly important work. But on some level, unless an alien steps out of a craft and allows himself to be filmed for everybody to see, it's sort of not falsifiable, or as one of my favorite physicists, Richard Feynman, would say, not even wrong. So in this video, I wanted to talk about maybe the most underrated inroad to disclosure, and that is the recent history of people that you've all heard of. People like Robert J. Oppenheimer, Edward Teller, Curtis LeMay, possibly even Henry Kissinger, who were involved with UFO secret programs. If we could prove that any of these people actually had something to do with the UFO legacy program, that would be a massive breakthrough when it came to disclosure. A lot of these people have relatives that are still alive. They died not too long ago. This is fairly recent history, and they're extremely esteemed scientists, military, and government personnel. So without further ado, I filmed this a couple of months ago, and it was actually based on a private presentation I gave in front of a group of scientists in Italy, which turned into a debate with scientific skeptic Michael Shermer.
What about these things that supposedly move far faster than the speed of sound without the sonic boom?
Yeah, how is that possible?
How is that possible?
That's right, it's not.
That's so where it gets weird.
That's where it gets weird, right?
But
so
that's where
is it
the
really
question
moving?
Is it ours?
Is it really moving at that speed, or is it a misperception of the video, a miscalculation?
A lot of people were interested in this, and basically it is a resuscitation of a lost timeline in American history. A timeline in which top American military, government, and scientific brass were incredibly deep on the UFO issue. They seem to be studying it.
Since 1947, we have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources.
They were looking into anti-gravity, and all of these programs were bound up with American atomic programs. I hope for you this video essay represents a very hard-headed, detailed chronology that is a good basis point or jumping off point for further speculation and study. This episode is brought to you by Raycons. When it comes to your earbuds, don't settle. They're literally an appendage on your body. Raycons everyday earbuds are head and shoulders better than anything else I've tried. They have a 32-hour battery life, so I'm never hunting for a charger. They have active noise cancellation, and they're also just more comfortable than any earbuds I've ever used. Whether I'm on a walk, a run, calling somebody, listening to a podcast, or in the editing room, Raycon is the perfect solution for any of those environments. Plus, the multi-point connectivity means I can seamlessly switch between my phone and laptop without missing a beat, which, as you know, can be an issue with other headphones. I'm using the black ones here, but they come in a wide array of awesome colors you can select from. The wireless charging case is also epic. The protective case design matches the earbud's sleek look. And again, you have wireless charging, so you rarely need to juice them up. Finally, they're just really affordable. And you have a 30-day happiness guarantee, so you might as well order them. If you want to try them out, go to buyraycon.com/Jesse Michels and get a 20 to 50% site-wide discount. The link is in the description and the pinned comment below. To the extent we can actually uncover whether any of these people actually worked on these secret, gravity-related or UFO programs, I think, that's a way more exciting revelation than, again, video, data, all these other things which I think would be very helpful, but not move the needle nearly as much as, this kind of recent history, this forgotten timeline. So in 1971, the Australian Joint Intelligence Organization, which is basically Australia's CIA, came out with a memo. And the whole thrust of the memo is written by the head of their nuclear division, a guy named Harry Turner, who was looking into U.S. efforts into UFOs and anti-gravity. And his belief was basically like the U.S. had thrown all the other countries off the trail. See, the U.S. at the time had this program called Blue Book. It was the official Air Force program studying UFOs in the 50s and 60s. And yet, Blue Book would kind of minimize, downplay, rationalize, explain away all UFO sightings. And Harry Turner in the early 70s is realizing on behalf of, again, his sort of CIA, that actually U.S. inquiries into anti-gravity and UFOs go way deeper than meets the eye. And actually there were real programs behind Blue Book that were far more vital than the research being done that was kind of front-facing to throw the public off the trail and to throw other countries off the trail on behalf of the U.S. And so this document, this 1971 Australian document, is basically a comprehensive documentation of all U.S. inquiries into anti-gravity and UFOs in the 50s and 60s. And it says some very bombshell things. It lists the scientists that were involved in these programs, and it lists names like, you've probably heard of a lot of these people: Edward Teller, Freeman Dyson, Robert J. Oppenheimer as being deeply involved in anti-gravity research. It lists academic outposts that the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence was implicitly backing, basically some of our top research institutes at the time. And then it lists all of the biggest aerospace companies at the time as well. So, Bell Aircraft, they had just broken the sound barrier in 1947. You have Martin Corporation. This is pre-merger with Lockheed, so kind of pre-Lockheed Martin. Lear Corporation, they had just invented the first business airliner. And so these are, really important claims that we have to look into. Is any of this true? Or does any of this actually comport with evidence that we have from the time? Do we have any artifacts to actually support the fact that we were actually looking this deeply into UFOs and anti-gravity? Well, actually, we do. So in 1956, there's actually an article from Young Men's Magazine, which is kind of an aviation and hobbyist magazine. And the headline of the article is "The G-Engines Are Coming." And it basically has quotes from all of the top aerospace patrons that I just mentioned in the Australian memo, exuding confidence that the US is going to beat gravity, and it's right around the bend. This is basically a second Manhattan Project, and in the next 5 or 6 years, we are going to beat gravity. And so you have all these crazy quotes. You have Lawrence Bell basically saying, "We are working with nuclear fuels and equipment to cancel out gravity." And then you had George S. Trimble. He's the VP of Martin Corporation. So he runs their anti-gravity division, which most people don't even know they had an anti-gravity division called RIAS, Research Institute for Advanced Study. And he's saying that beating gravity could be done in about the time it took to build the first atom bomb. So again, sort of crazy stuff, all in accordance with that Australian memo. But as you know, of course, industrialists can be a little quacky. They can be off with their timelines. They don't always have the best sense of, physics and where it's headed. So what were the smartest people, the top theoretical physicists actually doing at the time? Well, they were also kind of obsessed with gravity. In fact, in 1957, there's this UNC, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill conference. UNC Chapel Hill is one of the CIA's academic outposts listed in the Australian intelligence memo. And the patron of this entire organization is this guy named Agnew Bonson. Agnew Bonson was so obsessed with UFOs and anti-gravity that he wrote a science fiction novel called The Stars Are Too High, which is basically about a fake alien invasion, but perpetrated by men who have created these anti-gravity crafts. And so he's obsessed with beating gravity, and the whole thing is kind of bound up with aerospace. In fact, Lewis Whitten is Martin Corporation's representative from RIAS. Remember, we mentioned George Trimble. So Lewis Whitten works for George Trimble. You might recognize Whitten from his last name. His son goes on to be one of the most prominent string theorists, in the world. But just look at the names here. You have Bryce DeWitt, John Wheeler, Peter Bergman, Richard Feynman. The top theoretical physicists at the time all convened at UNC Chapel Hill to talk about gravity in the Einsteinian paradigm. In fact, John Wheeler would complain against this kind of prevailing ethos of the whole conference and how interested it was in anti-gravity, because he would say, I just want to study gravity and why it breaks down, why Einstein seems to break down at subatomic scales. So it's clear that this conference is very kind of bound up with aerospace, because Bryce DeWitt almost worked at Martin Corporation. You had Lewis Whitten, who's working at Martin Corporation. In fact, the whole thing was so bound up with aerospace that it was actually sponsored by Wright Air Development Center. So Wright Air Development Center is one of the first Air Force bases in the US. It's in Dayton, Ohio. It was founded in 1917. And, they basically tested a lot of the most advanced, aircraft and propulsion in the early 20th century. It's named after the Wright brothers, of course. And so why is Wright Air Development Center, the top Air Force base in the US, sponsoring this theoretical physics conference around beating gravity and possibly even figuring out anti-gravity? What was their interest in anti-gravity? Well, a lot of people don't know this, but they actually had a team of physics researchers working on anti-gravity at the time at Wright Air Development Center. And so you had this guy, Josh Goldberg, who's a PhD from Syracuse, and his group is called the Aerospace Research Laboratory. And their sole mandate is basically to figure out how to beat gravity. In fact, just to show you how seriously the lore was that Wright-Patterson might have in its possession kind of exotic technology that might require the study of anti-gravity in its possession, and just how, impressive the circles that those rumors reached, I want to actually show an interview with Barry Goldwater, who was then a sitting senator. He then went on to actually be a presidential candidate. And here's a good video of him discussing his inquiries into what secret tech was being held at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
I think the government does know. I can't back that up, but I think that at Wright-Patterson Field, if you could get into certain places, you'd find out what the Air Force and the government knows about UFOs. Reportedly, a spaceship landed. It was all hushed up, quieted, and I've never heard about much of it. I called Curtis LeMay and I said, General, I know we have a room at Wright-Patterson where you put all this secret stuff. Could I go in there? I've never heard him get mad, but he got madder than hell at me, cussed me out, said, don't ever ask me that question again.
So that was a 1994 Larry King interview. But Barry Goldwater is clearly talking about being stiff-armed by the sitting chief of staff of the Air Force at the time, Curtis LeMay, from ever getting in to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, then called Wright Airfield. And so it's this really important question. What was sitting at Wright Airfield, and why were they so interested in figuring out a theoretical understanding of anti-gravity? And so there are a few interesting possible explanations for this. Now, one that a lot of people don't know is that there was actually tech transfer from Nazi anti-gravity programs that made it into Wright Airfield. And so you have, I'm just going to give you kind of the high level. There's actually a secret kind of weapons facility in Czechoslovakia in modern day Poland, run by SS officer Hans Kammler. It was called Kammlerstab. They were working on all sorts of crazy kind of anti-gravity and UFO technology. If you want to learn more about that, you should watch my documentary I made about Townsend Brown, the man who built UFOs for the CIA, where we go into more detail there. But you had all these Nazi scientists who worked under Kammlerstab, who ended up working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And so you have this crazy kind of narrative where there's this project called the Abocar, which was in 1952. It was a joint operation between the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, British aircraft. It was run by this guy named John Frost. But through Operation Paperclip, which we now know about, where we siphoned off all of these Nazi scientists working on vital programs so that the Russians wouldn't get them after World War II. You have a bunch of these kind of Nazi scientists, guys like Richard Mita, Victor Schauberger, Henry Kawanda. Victor Schauberger had his own design for a flying saucer. It was called an impeller. Richard Mita was working on kind of high voltage experiments, very similar to an American scientist named Townsend Brown, which we'll get into. And then Henry Kawanda actually filed a patent in 1936 for his lenticular aerodyne saucer. He was a Romanian engineer, and he was actually doing consulting at Wright Air Force Base for, again, the Abocar project, which started in Canada but was taken over by Wright Airfield. The Abocar famously had trouble flying, but it was this saucer-shaped thing, and it used kind of a radial gas flowing turbine engine, not, any sort of anti-gravity. This might explain, given the saucer shape, why Wright Airfield was kind of looking into anti-gravity propulsion. Maybe they wanted to use that for the Abocar. The second reason that Wright Airfield might have wanted a theoretical framework for anti-gravity is because there were actually vital experiments going on in the world of anti-gravity at the time. In fact, you had this physicist named Thomas Townsend Brown who had these gravitator experiments. It was basically you had this asymmetric capacitor, you had a positively charged plate, a negatively charged plate, these two electrodes. The positive plate would be smaller in size than the negative electrode, and you would kind of pump the whole thing with megavoltage range electromagnetism, and you'd get this infinite chasing effect where the negative electrode would chase the positive electrode, even if the positive electrode is facing skywards. And so basically, like the whole thing seemed to beat gravity or create some sort of synthetic gravitational field just through the simple input of electromagnetism. Now, I can't overstate the implications of this. Einstein spent the latter half of his career trying to marry electromagnetism and gravity. And so obviously you're going to ruffle a lot of feathers by saying that this kind of quacky American inventor, who dropped out of, he did go to Caltech, but he ended up dropping out, actually kind of experimentally tied these two irreconcilable forces and unified the field. But you have all these amazing, credible witnesses at the time witnessing his experiments and saying, we have no idea how this worked. This is astounding. So you had Edward Teller, who's the inventor of the hydrogen bomb, one of the smartest, people alive at the time. And again, listed in that Australian document as being involved in anti-gravity. He actually sees a modified version of Townsend Brown's fan precipitator experiment. And his quote is, "I don't know how this works." And his wife turns to Townsend Brown's daughter, Linda, and she says, "You don't know how nice it is to hear him say that." So even Edward Teller was astounded by Townsend Brown's experiments. Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay witnessed his experiments. In fact, Linda, Townsend Brown's daughter, recalls Curtis LeMay chasing Townsend Brown down the stairs because he was so interested in his experiments.
And Curtis LeMay kind of followed my dad down the steps.
Bill Lear, who's mentioned in that Australian document, who's kind of an aerospace titan at the time, known as the autopilot wizard. His office is right across the street from Townsend Brown's Guidance Technologies, which was in Santa Monica in the 50s. They were close collaborators, and so he was a witness of the experiments. And then Agnew Bonson, who actually was the patron who I mentioned, who sponsors the Chapel Hill Conference in 1957 with all the top theoretical physicists. He is simultaneous to funding Townsend Brown and his gravitator experiments. So I think it's, a possible mental framework is that you have these like really smart theoretical physicists kind of groping in the dark for a solution, a mathematical solution to anti-gravity, where while in the back, you have this kind of quacky inventor physicist, Townsend Brown, actually doing kind of the vital experimentation. And then finally, for the purposes of Wright Airfield, you have Victor Bertrandius, who's a technical representative from Wright Airfield, who witnesses Townsend Brown's experiments in Los Angeles. And there's a direct quote from him where he says, "Believe it or not, I think I just saw a flying saucer, and it frightened me." And so you have a guy who's connected with Wright Airfield, and he's seeing this gravitator experiment, and it's freaking him out. And Victor Bertrandius works for the famous Colonel Albert Boyd, who runs Wright Airfield's Flight Test Division. And so, again, they might want a theoretical framework because they've seen these experiments that seem to defy gravity at the time. In fact, Wright Airfield might have been so interested in Townsend Brown's experiments that according to his daughter, Linda, he actually had a technical consultant named Charles Wyatt Miller from Wright Airfield living with his family at all times, basically following them around wherever they went. So they were seriously keeping tabs on him. So again, Wright Airfield might have been privy to these sort of experiments, and then that might have made them interested in kind of a theoretical understanding of anti-gravity. And, you know, Townsend Brown is kind of shrouded in controversy. There's a lot of kind of disinfo about his career. Just to push back on some of the detractors, here is a recently declassified FBI document. At least according to the FBI at the time in 1943, he was known to be the Navy's top expert when it came to radar. And so again, I'm not saying that, you know, expertise in radar means that necessarily his anti-gravity experiments actually worked, but I do think the idea that he's this amateur quack does quickly dissolve upon any further investigation. Not only that, but there's a lot of evidence that Townsend Brown's work actually made it into the B-2 stealth bomber. In fact, a lot of people say that B-2 is named after Byfield Brown, which is his experiments, his capacitor experiments. And again, this is something I wasn't quite sure of. You do have a lot of interesting, you have this 1968 paper that Northrop published, and it's basically about Northrop's investigation into electroaerodynamics, and which is basically Townsend Brown's work, and you know, it sort of mysteriously disappears. So you have some possible evidence there. But you also have, you know, Britain's premier aerospace journalist, a guy named Bill Gunston, basically saying, you know, I'm very sure that Townsend Brown's work made it into the B-2 stealth bomber. And, you know, this is basically this kind of survey level overview of all of the aero engine technology in aerospace. He's writing for Air International magazine in 2000. Gunston goes on to write that he had been well acquainted with the rudiments of T.T. Brown's theories for years, but he had no wish to reside in the Tower of London, so he'd refrained from discussing clever aeroplanes with leading edge charged to millions of volts positive and trailing edges charged to millions of volts negative. Again, that negative to positive thrust is literally Townsend Brown's experiments. So leading guy when it comes to, you know, radar in the Navy, and his work probably made it into literally the United States prize stealth bomber. Like, maybe he's more serious than meets the eye. Maybe he's not this complete joke as he's kind of made out to be. And then you actually do some digging and you realize he kind of planted all the disinformation about himself. And a lot of the people that kind of made him out to be a joke, you know, probably had incentives to do that. And for more information on him, you should probably just watch the documentary I made called, again, The Man Who Built UFOs for the CIA. Final explanation for why Wright Airfield might have wanted a theoretical understanding of anti-gravity or to figure out anti-gravity propulsion is because they had an alien flying saucer in their possession. And so they had retrieved a flying saucer or disc from the Roswell crash in 1947. That's kind of the most famous story. Those crash materials reportedly made their way down to Dallas-Fort Worth, to Fort Hood originally, and then they were taken to Wright Airfield. And so that's, you know, what all the lore says. You have, you know, this picture here of Jesse Marcel holding, you know, being forced to hold, you know, he claimed that he was forced to do this photo op with this, you know, weather balloon, but in fact, you had this kind of malleable memory metal, and it was kind of disc shaped, and you had these weird hieroglyphics on it, and it was actually taken to Wright Airfield. And so again, these are three possible explanations as to why Wright Airfield was so interested in anti-gravity at the time. Kind of Nazi tech transfer from their anti-gravity programs, Townsend Brown and his, you know, vital gravitational experiments, which I don't know if they worked, but they at least convinced a lot of top military and academic and scientific brass at the time. Or you had alien material taken from Roswell and, you know, moved to Wright Airfield. Now, Wright Airfield actually successfully reverse engineered a German pulse jet engine in 1943. It was literally the place that would reverse engineer adversary technology if that was ever retrieved. So it would make sense if you found an alien vehicle, you would take it there first. It also is one of the first centers for nuclear propulsion in the US. So you're getting this crazy picture where in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the US had a way deeper interest at very high levels when it came to anti-gravity and UFOs. And maybe we had more understanding of these domains than meets the eye. So this could explain the Twining Memo. So the Twining Memo is this famous document that people in UFO world love to cite. They think it's, you know, this super important document because you have this guy, General Nathan Twining, who runs the Air Material Command for the Air Force. He's responsible for all aircraft development, the most advanced aircraft development for the Air Force. And he writes in 1947, he says, UFOs are real, they're not visionary or fictitious. He goes on to describe their attributes. They have no vapor trails. They display rates of, extreme rates of climb and maneuverability, all sorts of observables that now the Pentagon has come out with. And they say, similar things about UFOs, like, no visible propulsion, that sort of thing. This is that version of that, but for 1947. But by far, the most interesting part of the Twining Memo is the part that everybody ignores. It's the postscript of the memo, where Twining actually writes, "It is possible within present U.S. knowledge, provided extensive detailed development is undertaken to construct a piloted aircraft which has the general description of the object above." And again, he's describing these attributes which break physics when it comes to aviation. And he's saying we actually have in our present knowledge the ability to build these things. And then he goes on to say, without mentioning kind of the Manhattan Project, that we basically need a Manhattan Project style effort in order to do this. So then he goes on to say, any developments in this country along the lines indicated would be extremely expensive, time consuming, and at the considerable expense of other projects, and therefore should be set up independently of existing projects. So again, if you have a secret UFO program, it should probably be fully insulated from civilian bureaucrats moving in and out of government. It should be this top secret thing with only the most vital scientists and only kind of super deep intel people with a need to know basis who aren't moving in and out of government and aren't going to kind of spill the beans. Well, the idea that this is actually housed in kind of a Manhattan Project style effort, and that the Manhattan Project secrecy overlays UFO secrecy, completely comports with David Grush's whistleblower revelations in 2023. So David Grush is a buddy of mine. He was at the Air Force. He was at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And he was also part of the UAP task force to look into UFOs. And he basically uncovered what he claims to be these kind of decades-long UFO reverse engineering programs in deep black compartments of the government. And he says that the guy that actually set up the secrecy protocols for UFOs was Robert J. Oppenheimer and another guy named Robert Sarbacher.
I would probably ask Sarbacher, Oppenheimer, and be like, what was your thought process in the 40s and 50s, squirreling this away? I mean, besides overlaying the Manhattan Project secrecy.
And these guys basically are responsible for the 1954 Atomic Energy Commission, which overlaid nuclear secrecy on top of UFO secrecy in this really kind of interesting cloak and dagger way. So if you actually read the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, the definition of special nuclear material is actually incredibly flexible and pliable and kind of at the discretion of the Atomic Energy Commission. It's basically any material that kind of emits any radioactive properties. So any alpha, beta, gamma radiation, anything radioactive is born secret under this Atomic Energy Act of 1954. And so if, an aerospace contractor or the CIA or anybody guarding a nuclear base encounters any of these sort of UFOs, that material gets immediately shrouded in secrecy and immediately overlaid with the same classification system as nuclear secrets.
No, it is. If you actually read the Atomic Energy Act, if something is not a nuke, but it has radiological energy coming off it, alpha, beta decay, whatever.
Same secrecy.
Same secrecy.
And the crazy part about all of this is that UFOs seem to just show up over nuclear bases. In fact, that's this incredibly important correlation that a lot of people don't know about. There's a journalist named Robert Hastings who documents 167 UFO sighting cases at nuclear bases across the entire United States. In fact, every single nuclear base in the US has been visited, according to him. And it's 167 ICBM security personnel, radar operators, people who work at these nuclear sites who are on what's called the PRP program, where they have to be the picture of mental health, and they have to report if they're on, ibuprofen or anything, because they are guarding the crown jewels of American defense in the form of these nuclear silos. And so all of these guys report seeing kind of anomalous objects in the skies. In many cases, they actually report the sites being rendered inoperable. There are a couple of famous cases, Bob Jacobs in 1964 at Vandenberg, Robert Salas, 1967 at Malmstrom Base in Montana. You have a ton of these cases, even up until 2010, right before Robert Hastings retired, F.E. Warren nuclear base in Wyoming. where you had this outage for an hour on the base, which is obviously this massive national security concern. And Hastings actually did some back channeling with some of the nuclear base employees there. And they basically attribute that outage to this tic-tac shaped oblong object flying around and taking out the power at F.E. Warren. And so you have all these cases. He's documented all of this in this fantastic book called UFOs and Nukes. And lest you be thinking that Robert Hastings and David Grush and Oppenheimer and all these people are kind of part of some, American national security cabal, and that there is no tie between nuclear and UFOs, just to show you that that is definitely not the case, there's literally a town in Japan called Lino, which is in Fukushima, where they have a nuclear civilian power plant that is dedicated to UFOs. In fact, Vice made a documentary on this town, I believe in 2020 or 2021, and it shows that a lot of the residents of the town are obsessed with UFOs. There's a museum that is dedicated to UFOs at the top of this mountain. You have all these bizarre geomagnetic anomalies. And so clearly this is not some coordinated psyop. And so again, civilian nuclear and weapons nuclear are this important thread. In fact, the appendix of UFOs and Nukes by Robert Hastings includes 7 or 8 cases of UFOs showing up around civilian nuclear reactors as well. Fukushima, of course, is famous for its nuclear disaster in 2011, but they've had a civilian grid there since the 70s. And this museum dedicated to UFOs was actually set up in the 90s. So again, I think this would require far more coordination, than just this kind of deep state national security cabal in the US. This is clearly a global phenomena, and this correlation with nuclear is this incredibly important point that needs to be investigated. Finally, I think one of the most important points when it comes to UFOs is that UFOs were marginalized as kind of quacky and not serious, but they were marginalized by 2 important people, these physicists in the 50s and 60s, who were tied in with the atomic programs themselves. So H.P. Robertson, which created the mandate for Blue Book, this Robertson memo, which is now declassified, but it was meant to be kept secret at the time, in 1952, at the end of 1952, before Blue Book gets formed in 1953, the Robertson panel basically makes Blue Book this kind of, let's explain UFOs away, let's downplay it in media, books, that sort of thing. Well, people don't know that H.P. Robertson actually had was very tied in with American atomic programs. In fact, he was on the National Defense Research Council under FDR, and he had a lot of ties with people like Vannevar Bush. And Edward Condon was also very close with Vannevar Bush. Condon was actually super close with Oppenheimer. They studied at Göttingen together in Germany in the 1930s. He actually grew up in Alamogordo, right around the bend from Los Alamos, and helped pick Los Alamos as a spot for the Manhattan Project. And he even wrote the Los Alamos Primer, which was basically a document that all employees had to read upon getting hired at Los Alamos. Well, Condon actually loses his security clearance kind of mysteriously in 1953-54. The nominal reason for him losing his security clearance was that, he spent some time at Berkeley. He was this journalist. He was, he had all these labor sympathies, and that he was, schmoozing with socialists or whatever. And so that's why he lost his security clearance. But what's very interesting is that he actually wrote the McMahon Secrecy Act of 1946, which is the precursor to the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. So Condon actually goes on to debunk UFOs from 66 to 69. He is part of what's known as the Condon Committee, this, in Boulder, Colorado, this commission, which is basically, rigged to basically show that all U.S. efforts when it comes to studying UFOs were a total waste of time, effort, and money. This was supposed to be independent of the Air Force, but in fact, Condon was in close coordination with Air Force colonels like Robert Hippler, and there's even a written memo where Hippler is telling Condon, hey, you should show that all UFO research was a waste of money. We don't want another Blue Book. And so it was this kind of rigged thing to debunk UFOs, and it kind of is the nail in the coffin of UFO research from the public's perspective in the late 60s and onwards. Good analogy to the UFO thing is to go to another thing that, skeptics were saying was science fiction just 3 to 4 years ago. And now we have mounting evidence that it's actually a real phenomena and there's real science behind it. And so that's Havana Syndrome. Havana Syndrome, again, is this kind of, destabilizing dizziness, migraines, all these weird symptoms that American embassy workers and diplomats across the world were saying that they were experiencing. And you have all these skeptics saying, it's this mass psychogenic illness, they're hallucinating it, they're making it up, kind of blame the victim mentality. And just recently, 60 Minutes, in collaboration with Der Spiegel, came out with a piece showing that a lot of these were actually US counterintel agencies working specifically on Russia. And so there's this concern that Russia is responsible for these kind of high frequency beam weapons that are causing, these issues. And so, I think that's a really good analogy for the UFO thing, where you have credible witnesses. Now we think it's total sci-fi. And the best way to actually corroborate this is to go back to this kind of forgotten timeline where in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, people actually took this stuff seriously. And so here's a really good example. You have this recently declassified document around the SALT II détente talks, where the U.S. is attempting peace with the USSR, and you have, and you have Secretary of State Kissinger, and he's talking to the Russian ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, and he's basically saying that these microwave beams are making their way into the U.S. embassy in Russia, in Moscow, and in fact, they are causing these rare illnesses. And you have the American ambassador to the USSR at the time, Walter Stossel, actually being medically discharged because of a rare form of blood cancer that he would eventually die from because of these high-frequency microwave beams. And if you read this transcript, he says, "You are joking," and Kissinger says, "I am serious." And he doubles down. He even gets specific about the amount of hours that the beams are kind of flooding the embassy. And so if you go back to the historical record, you have very serious people like Henry Kissinger, kind of as serious as it gets, taking, this idea of, what we would now call Havana Syndrome very seriously. And again, this was thought to be completely science fiction, this, psychosomatic thing a few years ago. And so I think that's the perfect analogy to UFOs, where you have, the 2004 Nimitz sighting, for example. You have these, kind of multi-day corroborated, multi-sensor, FLIR data. You have radar data, which unfortunately we don't have access to, but you have plenty of, credible eyewitness pilots, people like Commander David Fravor, seeing these tic-tac objects. So you have to go back to the historical record to corroborate this. In fact, if you go to the SALT talks again in 1971, that's a really good analogy to the modern UFO conversation, where you have all these credible witnesses, people like Commander David Fravor, radar operators, Navy fighter pilots, who are seeing these tic-tac shaped or saucer shaped objects seemingly breaking physics in the sky. And if you actually just go back to the historical record, this is just the tip of the iceberg that I'm presenting here. You can, uncover all sorts of mounting evidence for this. And so I think resuscitating this forgotten timeline is the way to make progress on UFOs. And that, it's really fun to have these debates about ontological truth, but they kind of devolve into metaphysics and these kind of everything is everything conversations. And so if we want to make real progress, let's talk about the real personnel, the credible personnel who are at the top circles of American military, academic, and scientific circles looking into UFOs and anti-gravity. Over the last couple of years, I've had a lot going on simultaneous to the channel. I've invested in a lot of startups and, been involved in other things. And now I really want to focus a lot of my time on creating content for you. So I'm going to do more raw stuff. I just want more kind of sheer output. If you have anybody that you want to hear from and get interviewed, please let me know in the comments. If you want any topics covered, let me know. Or if you have any suggestions, generally, I'm all ears. And yeah, I'm pumped. I think it's going to be a really good year. And I think we're going to uncover a lot of crazy stuff.